What the person you tried to humiliate was the one who could destroy you. First-class cabins aren't just about luxury. They're about exclusivity, about unspoken rules, about knowing who belongs and who doesn't. And when Isolde Mercer stepped onto that plane, the judgment began before she even took her seat. The glances, the whispers, the carefully measured smiles from the flight crew, all of it sent the same message. She isn't one of us. It wasn't the first time. A black woman in a world built for someone else always learns to recognize the signs. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Isolde wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner. So watch closely. Watch as the condescension turns into confusion. Watch as the sneers turn into silence. Watch as the woman they dismissed, insulted, and tried to push out reveals the truth and makes them all pay for their arrogance. Would you have stayed quiet in Isolde's position or fought back from the start? Comment below. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Like and subscribe for more stories where power shifts in the most unexpected ways. The airport thrived in its usual rhythm. Intercom voices announcing departures, hurried footsteps echoing off polished floors, and the rhythmic beep of boarding passes being scanned. Isolde Mercer moved with effortless grace, her navy blazer perfectly tailored, her black heels clicking with quiet authority. She had flown first class more times than she could count. This was routine, or at least it should have been. Reaching the boarding gate, she handed her phone to the flight attendant, Sloane Kessler. The woman barely looked at her before scanning the pass. A sharp, loud beep. The screen turned red. Invalid ticket. Identity verification required. Isolde's brow lifted slightly. That had never happened before. Sloane barely concealed her smirk. Looks like there's a problem, she said, her tone teetering between fake sympathy and amusement. Isolde remained calm. That's odd. This ticket was confirmed hours ago. Sloane didn't even pretend to double-check. Well, the system doesn't lie, she said, tapping her nails against the podium. No valid boarding pass, no boarding. A quiet murmur rose behind Isolde as the passengers in line began shifting impatiently. She was not about to give them a spectacle. Keeping her expression neutral, she held out her phone again. Scan it again. Sloane sighed dramatically but complied. This time, the machine accepted it without hesitation. Her smirk faltered for half a second before she recovered. Must have been a glitch. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the inconvenience. Just a knowing glance exchanged with a male attendant nearby, as if they were in on some private joke. As Isolde walked past, she heard Sloane mutter under her breath, just loud enough to sting. These systems really should filter better. The old, familiar irritation flared in Isolde's chest, but she ignored it. She had long since learned that power wasn't proven by how you reacted, but by how you controlled the game. She stepped into the jet bridge, breathing in the cooler, sterile air as she neared the cabin. First class gleamed ahead of her. Pristine leather seats, gold-trimmed accents, the soft glow of ambient lighting. This was her world, the one she had built for herself, where she belonged. As she reached up to stow her carry-on, she froze. Her bag was gone. A sleek, black leather case embossed with her initials, containing her laptop, documents, and a vintage diamond bracelet from her mother, vanished. Sloane strolled in moments later, feigning surprise. Everything okay? Isolde turned, voice steady. My carry-on isn't here. Sloane tilted her head, a slow smirk forming. Oh, what did it look like? Black leather, monogrammed initials. I placed it right here. Sloane tapped a manicured nail against her chin. Oh, that one. Yeah, the crew probably moved it. Sometimes they assume certain bags belong in the economy hold. She paused for effect, then shrugged. Happens all the time. There it was. That calculated emphasis on economy. Isolde's fingers curled into her palm. I need my bag back. Now. Relax, Miss Mercer, Sloane drawled. It's probably safe somewhere. But I can't just stop everything to track down one bag. That's a job for ground staff. A game. That's what this was. A power move disguised as an inconvenience. Then get the ground staff, Isolde said smoothly. Sloane huffed but nodded to a junior attendant. Fine, but I can't make any promises. These things have a way of disappearing when they get mixed with lower-class storage. Isolde exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to snap the mask of condescension right off her face. She had seen this before, felt it in the boardroom, heard it whispered at exclusive charity galas. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about class. It was about who was allowed to be here. Sloane thought she had the upper hand. Across the aisle, Sloane chatted animatedly with another flight attendant, occasionally glancing at Isolde with a smirk. The moment felt curated, like an inside joke Isolde wasn't in on. Just as she was about to settle in, Sloane reappeared, clipboard in hand. "Miss Mercer, I'm afraid there's an issue with your seat." Her voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few heads turned, curiosity flickering in their expressions. Isolde arched her brow. "Issue?" Sloane sighed dramatically. "Yes, unfortunately. This seat has been flagged for maintenance. It's out of service for this flight." She didn't bother lowering her voice. Isolde glanced around. The plush leather seat looked perfectly fine. "Maintenance? It seems fine to me." Sloane plastered on a tight-lipped smile. "Safety regulations, Miss Mercer. We take them seriously. But don't worry, we've found you another seat." She gestured toward the back of the first-class cabin. Isolde followed her gaze and immediately tensed. The new seat was in the last row of first class, wedged between two broad-shouldered men. It was the only middle seat in a cabin designed for spacious comfort. She exhaled slowly. "That's unacceptable." Sloane tilted her head. "I understand your frustration, but it's that or move to business class. I thought you'd prefer to stay in first." The condescension was sharp, wrapped in feigned professionalism. One of the men in the reassigned row glanced up and smirked. "Guess that means she's sitting with us, huh?" His companion chuckled under his breath. Isolde's grip tightened on her armrest. This was intentional. A flight attendant walked by, adjusting champagne glasses on a tray. Isolde caught her attention. "Excuse me, I'd like to speak to the cabin manager." Sloane's expression didn't falter, but a flicker of irritation passed through her eyes. "I am the lead attendant for this cabin. Then get someone above you." Isolde's voice remained steady, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Sloane hesitated, then forced another fake smile. "Of course, Miss Mercer. I'll see what I can do." She walked away with an exaggerated air of importance, leaving Isolde standing on display, while other passengers whispered among themselves. Minutes passed. No manager came. Instead, Sloane returned, this time with an apologetic shrug. "I spoke to the flight supervisor. Unfortunately, all premium seats are assigned. If you'd prefer not to take the one we offered, I can arrange for you to deplane and take a later flight." The suggestion was as clear as it was deliberate. It wasn't about safety or seating logistics. This was about making her leave. Isolde inhaled slowly, scanning the faces around her. A woman in a tailored red blazer avoided eye contact. A businessman in the front row glanced at her, then back at his laptop. No one spoke up. No one questioned it. She could argue, demand answers, but she knew how that would be perceived. A black woman challenging an airline's authority? They would twist it, make it about her being difficult, uncooperative. And Sloane was waiting for that. Instead, Isolde did something unexpected. She smiled, a slow, composed smile that made Sloane blink. "I'll take my seat." Without another word, she turned, walking to the cramped middle seat as if it were her choice. The two men flanking the seat exchanged amused glances as she slid in, adjusting her posture with an effortless grace that belied her anger. Sloane lingered for a second longer, perhaps hoping for some final protest, but when none came, she pivoted and strutted off, victorious. Isolde sat rigidly between the two men, her back straight, her face unreadable. The armrests pressed against her sides, restricting her movement. Every shift of the aircraft sent their shoulders brushing against hers. One of them glanced down at her lap, where her hands rested, then smirked before looking away. The other man spread his legs slightly wider, claiming even more space. She ignored them, keeping her focus on the front of the cabin. Sloane moved effortlessly between the other first-class passengers, her voice honeyed as she greeted them by name, offering them extra champagne, blankets, and personal greetings. Every so often, she would glance back toward Isolde, her lips twitching in amusement. When the drink service began, the attendants moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, pouring glasses of crisp white wine and golden champagne into elegant crystal flutes. The older man beside Isolde received his with a nod of approval. The other clinked his against his companions, chuckling at some joke Isolde didn't care to hear. The tray stopped at her row. She turned her head slightly, waiting. The flight attendant, Grace, according to her name tag, hesitated, glancing at Sloane, who gave a small shake of her head. Grace hesitated, then moved on without a word. Minutes passed. The scent of truffle pasta and buttered steak filled the cabin as the attendants delivered plates to the passengers, placing them carefully on the polished trays. Every passenger in first class received a meal. Every passenger except her. One of the men beside her wiped his mouth, sighing contentedly. "You should have ordered ahead," he muttered, not bothering to look at her. Isolde turned toward the aisle, catching Sloane as she passed. "Excuse me," she said smoothly, keeping her tone level. "I believe my meal was overlooked." Sloane tilted her head. "Oh, was it? I don't have you on the pre-order list. First-class dining is limited, you know." Isolde held her gaze. "I reserved my meal when I booked my ticket." Sloane gave a dramatic frown. "Let me check." She walked to the front, spoke quietly with Grace, then returned with a faux, sympathetic expression. "I'm afraid there's nothing left." The man on her left let out a low chuckle. "Tough break, huh?" Sloane leaned in slightly, her voice lower. "I can grab something from business class if you'd like." They might have a sandwich left. Isolde didn't react, didn't argue. That was what Sloane wanted. Instead, she slowly turned forward, adjusting the napkin on her lap as if she'd already eaten. Sloane lingered for a moment, expecting a response. But when Isolde gave her nothing, she eventually walked away, her amusement tinged with irritation. More time passed. The cabin dimmed as the crew prepared for the overnight portion of the flight. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, handing out warm towels and adjusting blankets for the other passengers. Isolde sat still, her hands folded neatly, her stomach empty. Sloane approached again, this time stopping just beside her. "Would you like anything else, Ingrid?" Isolde's fingers twitched slightly. The deliberate misnaming was another tactic, a psychological dig wrapped in fake politeness. Isolde had seen it before. "No." Sloane smiled. "Well, just let me know if you need anything, Ingrid." With that, she moved on, making sure the last thing Isolde heard before she disappeared was the sound of suppressed laughter from the men beside her. Isolde remained seated, her posture composed despite the growing discomfort from her confined position. Around her, passengers relaxed under cashmere blankets, sipping their last glasses of wine before drifting into peaceful slumber. The soft chime of service bells rang occasionally, a quiet request for another indulgence, another luxury. Isolde, however, sat in stillness, ignored and untouched by the comforts of first class. Sloane moved through the aisle with effortless grace, leaning down to whisper something to Grace, her tone low but pointed. Grace hesitated, casting a quick glance at Isolde before giving a small, uncertain nod. Isolde watched without turning her head, knowing full well she was being discussed. Seconds later, as Sloane passed her row, she let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough to carry. "It's fascinating really," she mused, feigning casual conversation with Grace. "How accessible first class has become. It used to be such an exclusive experience." She continued walking, not even sparing Isolde a glance, but the message was clear. A few rows ahead, a woman in a pearl necklace smirked before returning to her book. A businessman adjusted his cufflinks, indifferent. The man beside Isolde chuckled under his breath, amused by the exchange. Isolde remained motionless, her face carefully neutral. She would not give Sloane the satisfaction of a reaction, nor would she validate the unspoken agreement that she didn't belong. Minutes later, Sloane returned, carrying a small silver atomizer. She stopped briefly near Isolde's seat, adjusting the collar of her uniform before pressing down on the nozzle, releasing a fine mist into the air. A strong, cloying scent of expensive perfume filled the space. "The air feels so stuffy in here," Sloane murmured, wrinkling her nose. "We have to maintain a certain standard." She stepped away, leaving the artificial floral scent hanging in the air like an accusation. A tight, muted laugh came from across the aisle. Someone murmured something Isolde couldn't quite catch, but the tone was unmistakable. Mockery. Amusement at her expense. The men flanking her remained silent, but their smirks spoke volumes. Time stretched, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing in on all sides. The attendants continued their routine, offering personalized service to everyone but her. When a passing stewardess gently placed a folded blanket on the lap of the woman in the next row, Isolde lifted her gaze slightly. The attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then quickly walked past without offering her the same courtesy. Sloane made another round through the cabin, pausing at Isolde's row. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to examine something on the seatback monitor, then leaned just a little closer. "You seem tense," she remarked, her voice honeyed with artificial concern. "It must be overwhelming, sitting here. All this refinement." She straightened, smoothing her uniform. "Let me know if you need anything, Ingrid." The scent of Sloane's perfume still lingered in the air, mixing with the stale, pressurized atmosphere of the cabin. Isolde remained motionless, eyes forward, fingers interlocked in her lap. She refused to adjust her posture or wipe the thin sheen of sweat forming at the nape of her neck. She knew what Sloane wanted. She wouldn't give it to her. A clatter broke the temporary stillness as a fork hit the floor, followed by a startled gasp from a man in the front row. His voice, sharp and impatient, sliced through the cabin's hushed ambience. "My watch. Where is my watch?" His tone carried the distinct weight of entitlement, a man unused to misplacing things. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin as passengers turned their heads. Sloane, standing only a few feet away, moved swiftly toward the distressed man, her movements precise and controlled, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Sir, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, voice steeped in concern. The man gestured toward his bare wrist, his face a mask of exaggerated disbelief. "It was right here. It's a $20,000 timepiece. It didn't just disappear." Sloane hummed thoughtfully, then straightened, her eyes scanning the cabin with calculated deliberation before settling on Isolde. "Miss Mercer," she said, voice smooth as glass, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm going to have to ask you to open your bag." The words landed like a slap. Isolde didn't move. The accusation wasn't outright, but it didn't need to be. The way Sloane framed it, the way she let the silence stretch, forcing the idea to settle into the minds of the other passengers, was far more effective than pointing a direct finger. Someone shifted in their seat. The lingering gazes remained. The doubt had been planted, and that was enough. The man who lost his watch waved a dismissive hand. "Forget it. It's probably in my jacket." He turned away, already losing interest. Sloane, however, was far from finished. She turned to the cockpit door just as a junior flight attendant passed by, her expression tense. "You should inform the captain," Sloane said, voice carrying. "Miss Mercer is becoming disruptive." The younger woman hesitated, eyes flicking to Isolde, uncertainty evident in the slight downturn of her lips. "Is she?" she asked cautiously. Sloane's smile didn't falter. "She's making other passengers uncomfortable. We can't have that, can we?" It was a statement, not a question. A few seats away, a woman muttered something about needing a stress-free flight. Another passenger exhaled loudly, as if this ordeal had been an inconvenience to him personally. The younger attendant nodded reluctantly and disappeared into the cockpit. Isolde remained still, absorbing the shift in atmosphere, the new layer of tension. It wasn't fear or outrage she felt. It was something deeper, something colder. A realization, perhaps, that no matter how composed, how restrained, how meticulous she was, it wouldn't matter. Not here. Not now. A soft chime sounded over the intercom. Seconds later, the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We've been informed of a minor disturbance, and I'd like to remind everyone that this is a zero-tolerance flight. We ask all passengers to remain in their assigned seats and respect the crew's authority." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't far from one. The meaning was clear. Sit down. Be quiet. Don't be a problem. Sloane adjusted her cuffs and gave Isolde one final, knowing look before walking away, victorious. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, but the shift in atmosphere remained palpable. Isolde sat motionless, absorbing the weight of the captain's announcement, the unspoken agreement among passengers that she was now a disruption. The man beside her stretched his arms, bumping into her shoulder without acknowledgement, while the woman across the aisle glanced at her with barely concealed scrutiny. Sloane walked past again, her heels clicking against the carpet, pausing just long enough to let her presence linger. She didn't need to say anything. The seed had been planted. Minutes stretched on. The attendants resumed service, but it was different now. Their movements sharper, more efficient when tending to others, yet deliberately inattentive whenever they passed Isolde's row. When a fresh round of drinks was being served, Sloane returned, holding a tray of sparkling champagne, offering glasses with a warm smile to the surrounding passengers before stopping at Isolde's seat. Without breaking eye contact, she tilted the tray slightly. The motion seemed accidental, but the result was precise. A rush of ice-cold liquid spilled over Isolde's lap, seeping into the fabric of her skirt, spreading dark stains down to her thighs. A sharp inhale cut through the silence, followed by a chorus of soft gasps from the nearby rows. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then Sloane let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head. "Oh dear," she murmured, feigning concern as she set the tray aside. "I can be so clumsy sometimes." Isolde didn't react. Her hands remained folded in her lap, now wet from the champagne soaking into her clothes. The moment stretched unbearably, a calculated silence in which everyone waited for her to break, to snap, to give them something that justified everything. Instead, she exhaled slowly. "I'd like a towel," she said, her voice as steady as ever. Sloane pursed her lips as if considering, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a single, flimsy cocktail napkin. She extended it toward Isolde with a small, condescending smile. "This should help." A soft laugh rippled through the surrounding seats. Someone muttered something under their breath. Isolde didn't reach for it. The moment was drawn out, a silent battle of wills that Isolde refused to engage in. Finally, Sloane shrugged and placed the napkin on the armrest beside her before turning away, continuing down the aisle as if nothing had happened. The wet fabric clung to Isolde's skin, cold and humiliating, but she refused to adjust it, refused to give them the image they were waiting for. A chime rang overhead, signaling another announcement. Then, Sloane's voice came over the speaker, smooth and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience as we work through a minor administrative matter. We've encountered an issue with a passenger whose identity has not been fully verified. We ask that you remain seated while we coordinate with ground staff for further clarification. Thank you for your cooperation." The statement was crafted with careful precision, designed not to accuse but to suggest, to imply just enough doubt that it would settle in the minds of those listening. A ripple of murmurs followed, some hushed, others more open in their curiosity. Across the aisle, the pearl-clad woman leaned toward her seatmate, whispering something while glancing at Isolde with thinly veiled suspicion. The businessman from earlier folded his newspaper and set it aside, regarding Isolde now with mild, detached interest. The man on her left shifted slightly away from her, as if the very idea of her being an unverified passenger made her presence beside him suddenly unsafe. It was subtle but effective. Isolde remained still, her face expressionless, even as the implications of the announcement settled over her like a noose tightening around her throat. She understood exactly what Sloane was doing. She wasn't just isolating her. She was turning her into something uncertain, something that didn't belong, something that needed to be investigated. Suspicion was a powerful thing, and Sloane had wielded it masterfully. Somewhere up front, a flight attendant tapped on a tablet, scrolling through passenger information, her brows slightly furrowed. A brief exchange with another crew member followed before she disappeared behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. Sloane returned moments later, her steps measured, her expression carefully neutral. She stopped at Isolde's row, tilting her head slightly as if offering a chance for compliance. "Miss Mercer, I'm afraid there's been a problem with your reservation. There seems to be an administrative error regarding your status on this flight." Her voice carried a practiced authority, the kind designed to make people comply without question. "To avoid further inconvenience, we'll need to ask you to deplane at the next available stop where the issue can be resolved." Isolde met her gaze, unflinching. "There is no issue with my reservation." Sloane let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head slightly, as if disappointed by Isolde's refusal to cooperate. "Unfortunately, that's not for you to decide. I've already spoken with the captain, and he agrees that the best course of action is for you to disembark and clarify the situation on the ground." The words "best course of action" were deliberate. They sounded reasonable, like a logical request, rather than what it truly was, an attempt to remove her by force. A uniformed officer entered the cabin, his presence shifting the energy instantly. Passengers straightened in their seats, sensing something more serious unfolding. He moved toward Sloane, who turned to him with an air of professionalism. "This is the passenger in question," she said smoothly, gesturing toward Isolde without directly accusing her of anything. The officer gave Isolde a measured look, then cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." His voice was polite but firm, the kind that wasn't really offering a choice. The weight of every gaze in the cabin settled on Isolde, waiting for her to resist, waiting for her to make a scene, to confirm whatever assumptions had already been planted in their minds. She could hear the faint clicking of a woman's manicured nails tapping against an armrest, a quiet but impatient sound, as if waiting for this delay to be resolved. Across the aisle, a man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Sloane stood back, waiting. The moment stretched unbearably, and then, without a word, Isolde rose to her feet. The movement was slow, controlled, betraying none of the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. She adjusted the damp fabric of her skirt, ignoring the sensation of the champagne-soaked material clinging to her skin. The officer stepped aside, allowing her space to exit. A few murmurs rippled through the cabin, barely concealed whispers exchanged behind hands. Sloane exhaled triumphant. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Mercer. I'm sure this will all be sorted out soon." Her voice was laced with mockery, a final twist of the knife before Isolde was escorted away. Isolde walked down the narrow aisle, her posture impeccable despite the humiliation pressing against her like a second skin. The murmurs of passengers faded behind her, replaced by the sterile hum of the galley where flight attendants moved about, carefully avoiding her gaze. The officer leading her remained silent, his steps even, his authority unquestioned. Sloane followed a few paces behind, her presence radiating satisfaction. At the front of the cabin, the cockpit door loomed. The captain stood just outside, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He regarded Isolde for a brief moment before turning his attention to Sloane. "What's the issue here?" His voice was measured, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, mild confusion, perhaps. Sloane straightened her shoulders, adopting her most professional tone. "There was an administrative error with Miss Mercer's reservation," she explained smoothly. "To avoid further complications, we've arranged for her to disembark at the next available stop. Security has been informed, and ground staff will be ready to assist her once we land." The captain didn't react immediately. He glanced at Isolde, then at the uniformed officer standing beside her. His fingers flexed slightly before he exhaled, nodding once. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his access card, and turned toward the cockpit door. The moment the card slid through the reader, the panel beeped sharply, and the screen flashed a message in bold, unyielding letters. Access denied. Override restricted. Contact owner. The silence that followed was suffocating. The captain frowned, withdrawing the card and swiping again. The same message appeared. Sloane shifted slightly, her confident stance faltering for the first time. Would you care to explain? Isolde tilted her head slightly, taking in the scene before her. She could feel the weight of every unspoken word, every assumption that had been shattered in the span of a few seconds. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice even, unwavering. I own this plane. The words landed like a thunderclap. A heavy silence filled the cabin, thick with realization and the weight of an unforgivable mistake. Sloane stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she struggled to process the information unraveling before her. The officer beside her shifted uncomfortably, his prior authority now meaningless in the presence of someone who outranked the entire flight crew. The captain cleared his throat, his stance stiff, his expression carefully neutral. But there was no hiding the way his fingers clenched at his sides. He had been played, manipulated into believing a lie, and now the truth stared him in the face with cold, irrefutable certainty. Another sharp chime echoed through the intercom system, followed by a distinct click as the direct line to the airline's executive control center connected. A voice, smooth and deliberate, cut through the tense atmosphere. Captain Evans, are you still on board? The voice carried the kind of authority that left no room for misinterpretation. The captain exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening before he responded. Yes, sir. I'm here. There was a pause, brief but weighted, before the voice continued. Then tell me, Captain, why in God's name is Isolde Mercer being removed from her own aircraft? A sharp inhale came from somewhere behind them, a nervous shift in weight, a subtle but undeniable shift in power. The captain's gaze flicked toward Isolde, who remained composed, unaffected by the unraveling chaos around her. Slowly, deliberately, she arched a brow. The silence stretched unbearably before the captain finally spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with something dangerously close to regret. It was an oversight. The response wasn't enough. The intercom crackled again, the voice colder this time. An oversight? That's an interesting way to describe gross incompetence and blatant discrimination against the owner of this aircraft. The words landed like a slap, sending another ripple of unease through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged glances, some beginning to piece together what they had witnessed. The man who had been sitting beside Isolde leaned back in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable, as if hoping his earlier remarks would be forgotten. The voice on the intercom continued. Effective immediately, any crew member responsible for the mistreatment of Miss Mercer is to be relieved of duty. I trust that will not be an issue, Captain. The weight of the question left no room for negotiation. The captain swallowed, then nodded once, his voice clipped and resigned. Understood. Another chime echoed through the cabin, and every screen in first class flickered to life. A new message replaced the usual flight details, stark white text against a bold black background. Owner of this flight is Isolde Mercer. Anyone who mistreats her will be immediately suspended. The reaction was instantaneous. A murmur of shock swept through the cabin as passengers turned to look at Isolde with new eyes. Moments ago, she had been a target, an outsider, someone whose presence in first class had been questioned at every turn. Now, she was the most powerful person on the aircraft. The woman in pearls shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. The businessman who had ignored Isolde earlier cleared his throat, his gaze carefully averted. Even the uniformed officer who had been escorting her away took a step back, his presence now an unnecessary formality. Sloane, however, remained deathly still. Her face had lost all color, her breath shallow, her carefully curated confidence shattered beyond repair. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Her hands clenched at her sides, her body rigid with the weight of her impending downfall. The air inside the cabin had turned electric, thick with a tension that no one dared to break. every passenger sat frozen, unwilling to be the first to acknowledge the complete reversal of power that had just unfolded before them. The soft hum of the aircraft engines was the only sound in the suffocating silence, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unraveled only moments before. Isolde remained still, her posture composed, her gaze steady as she watched realization seep into every stunned expression in the room. Sloane's breath came in short, shallow bursts, her carefully curated world crumbling around her with each passing second. Her fingers twitched as if grasping for an argument, for some last shred of authority to cling to. But there was none left. She had lost control of the narrative, lost the ability to manipulate the situation to her advantage. The weight of her downfall pressed against her, cold and absolute. The captain cleared his throat, his voice breaking the unbearable silence. "Miss Kessler," he said, his tone devoid of the usual command he carried, now forced into reluctant obedience. "Hand over your badge and report to the nearest airline office upon landing." Sloane's head snapped toward him, her mouth parting slightly as if she had misheard him. "Captain, you can't be serious," she said, her voice brittle, on the verge of breaking. "This is a misunderstanding." The captain's jaw tightened. "The only misunderstanding here," he said, "is how you thought you could get away with this." The intercom crackled once more, and the same disembodied executive voice from before spoke with finality. "Miss Kessler, effective immediately. You are relieved of duty. You will be escorted from this aircraft upon arrival, and further disciplinary action will be taken. Any attempt to interfere will result in legal consequences." The word struck like a death sentence. Sloane's body locked up, her breath shallow as the gravity of her situation fully settled in. Her lips trembled as she turned her gaze to Isolde, desperation flickering behind her eyes, but there was no sympathy to be found there. The same passengers who had watched her humiliate Isolde with smug amusement now avoided her gaze entirely, unwilling to be associated with her downfall. The uniformed officer who had once stood beside her now moved with quiet precision, stepping forward with an unspoken directive. "Miss Kessler," he said, his tone professional, absent of malice, but equally absent of patience. "You need to come with me." Sloane took a step back, her composure fracturing, her voice barely a whisper. "No, this isn't happening." The officer extended a hand toward her arm, but she jerked away, her movements erratic. "I didn't do anything wrong," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. She turned wildly toward Isolde, expecting what? A reprieve? A lifeline? None came. Isolde simply met her gaze, unblinking, unmoving, letting the weight of every choice Sloane had made crush her under its inevitable consequence. When the officer reached for her again, this time she didn't resist. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her step stiff as she allowed herself to be led toward the galley, away from the first-class cabin she had once ruled with unchecked cruelty. As she passed Isolde's seat, she inhaled sharply, her lips pressing together as though she wanted to say something. No apology would come. No excuse would be enough. Instead, she turned away, disappearing behind the curtain, leaving behind only the bitter remnants of her arrogance. The cabin remained eerily still in the aftermath of Sloane's removal. No one moved. No one spoke. The reality of what had just happened still hung heavy in the air, undeniable and inescapable. Slowly, deliberately, Isolde reached for the untouched glass of champagne on the tray beside her. She lifted it with quiet precision, the chilled stem cool against her fingertips. She took a sip, letting the crisp effervescence linger for a moment before setting the glass back down with a soft clink. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but carried effortlessly through the silence. "It's funny," she mused, her tone almost conversational, as if addressing no one in particular. "Some people spend so much time convincing themselves they're in control, only to realize, too late, that they never had any power at all." A single breath passed before the weight of her words fully settled, sinking into the room like a final verdict. The pearl-clad woman swallowed visibly, her knuckles pale where they gripped the armrest. The businessman who had laughed earlier now looked anywhere but at Isolde. The man who had spread his legs too wide subtly adjusted his posture, suddenly aware of the space he took up. The attendants, those who had remained silent, those who had watched and done nothing, now moved with quiet precision, their gazes lowered as they cleared empty glasses and refolded linens with unnecessary focus. Isolde remained poised, untouched by the tension that thickened the air. She had nothing left to say. The consequences had already spoken for themselves. The captain straightened his uniform, clearing his throat before addressing the cabin with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "we thank you for your patience. We will now continue with our flight." The intercom clicked off, and the aircraft hummed forward, the turbulence of the past hour finally settling. Isolde glanced out the window, the sky stretching endlessly beyond the horizon, vast and unbothered by the trivial mistakes of those beneath it. She had come onto this flight expecting nothing more than a quiet journey home. Instead, she had been reminded of a lesson she had learned a long time ago. Power was not in who demanded it, but in who already had it. And tonight, she had reminded them all. The end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. What was the most shocking moment for you? Were you surprised by how everything unfolded? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in Isolde's place.